Okay, ladies and gentlemen, welcome to our third public meeting discussion regarding the Eastbound connector. We're going to be making a presentation that hopefully will be answering some of the questions that you had asked in the previous meetings and be able to address some of the concerns. We know that everyone's not necessarily going to be happy with all of the answers, but we are trying in as measured a manner as possible to address the concerns and to be able to make, as reflected by the letters to us, a bike infrastructure that is as safe as practical. You'll get enough of the presentation as we go through to see why some of the decisions were made. For those of you who might be new to this group of public meetings, there's enough background that you should have an understanding of where it came from and how it was generated. We will be doing most of the presentation all the way through, and we'll be reserving most of the questions till the end, unless something is tremendously pressing and impacts how you understand the rest of the presentation. And that's partly because as a public meeting, it is being recorded, and we want those questions to be recorded as well. We are hoping that you will see that things that were of concern to you before have been studied further. Some things were adjusted. There's a continuation. It's a continuation of how to move forward, design, tweak, challenge, and readdress some of the concerns that were raised all along. Our consultants are Kittleson Associates, and Laura will be making most of the presentation. Alex, will you be making part of the presentation as well?
No, Laura will be.
Okay. And Will is here from Kittleson Associates as well. So the agenda for this evening is to go over the timeline of the project, what we're doing, how we're doing it, a little bit of the project overview, which will give you some of the background, what initiated this in the first place, and how did we get here from where we were several years ago, and go through the whole project as much as possible to talk about the tools, the elements that make up the project, what are some of the challenges, and some of the issues to be addressed. And then we'll also be going through some of the questions and issues that have been raised and show how or why, and we've addressed those concerns. Then we'll have the question and answer for additional feedback, and we will also talk a little bit about changes to Walnut Street. As many of you may know, certainly in the last public meeting, some concerns were made about Walnut Street not necessarily operating as best as possible. And at that time, we talked about how we had done a walkthrough with not only the consultants, but some of the bicycle advocates. And we will be tweaking Walnut Street, and we'll be describing what those tweaks are like in this presentation. So, just as a quick reminder, the whole endeavor that we're doing here is in order to try to make real something called the Lancaster County Active Transportation Plan that was initiated way back in 2016. It was an effort to try to understand a variety of different ways that people can maneuver through the county and through the city as well. And one of those key infrastructure elements was the bicycle network, connecting the bicycle network from within the city to the areas that go out throughout the county. There'll be more about that in the presentation, but in the Lancaster County Active Transportation Plan was adopted in early 2019. The construction of Walnut Street was one of the first elements of fulfillment of that plan, and that took place also in 2019. And there were 5 steering committee meetings related to Vision Zero planning in 2020, and a little bit about Vision Zero will be described here as well. The Eastbound connector route analysis was taking place in the early days, just before COVID started, in the early days of COVID, and a little bit of that explanation will be in this presentation as well. And in mid to late 2020, the Lancaster Vision Zero was adopted. The idea that we will actually and have adopted Vision Zero as an initiative to reduce and eliminate dangerous accidents and deaths in the city of Lancaster by 2030. This active transportation plan is an integral part of the Vision Zero process. The Eastbound connector concept design was described in early 2021. The first public meeting related to the Eastbound connector was held on July 14th of this year. We realized that we did not necessarily give enough notice or appropriate notice, and so we wanted to make sure to double down in our communications and the way that we reached out to the community so that you understand what's going on. We opened up the Engage Lancaster site where you can submit comments at any time, and we established a more attenuated public engagement process so that we could make sure that we're hearing from you and can respond. The second public meeting was held September 23rd of 2021, and at that time we hoped that we were addressing a number of the concerns that had been raised earlier. We also let that be a more open forum to make sure that things that may not have been raised before or that you felt were not necessarily heard before could be heard and understood. We hope understood well. This tonight is a third public meeting which will be reflecting the input and what we've done to try to address those kinds of concerns. We're hoping you're going to be happy with it. We know that in the public discourse we can't make everybody happy, but we are trying our best to do it something that we think can be part of a very strong, good, alternate transportation infrastructure. And we're anticipating construction for this to take place probably in late 2022. We realize that there is actually a water main along this stretch that will be installed over the earlier part of 2022. And of course, we won't put the surface infrastructure on until that subsurface infrastructure is completed. So the public meeting tonight is focused on, and this particular stretch is focused on the Lemon Street stretch from College Avenue over here to the park, to the cemetery. The rest of the Eastbound connector is going to be done in different stages, but the focus of the design that we're doing over the course of these last several months is just this particular stretch. So, shall I continue or shall I turn it over to you, Laura?
I'm happy to.
I'm going to turn it over to Laura, who is much better at describing some of the design elements that go into making the project. And I and Cindy McCormick, who's the city engineer, are available to be able to answer questions as we get later on into the process. Carl Graybill, also from our office, is available to answer questions if necessary as well. So I'll turn it over to you, Laura. Thank you.
If everyone will just bear with me for 1 second. It didn't like the move. It wanted to stay in its same spot. Let's see if it'll come back and be my friend again. Thinking about it? Thinking about it.
Here it is.
All right. Current slide. Okay, sorry about that. So for the project purpose, where this came from originally was, as Steve mentioned, this all started with the adoption of the Lancaster Active Transportation Plan and the activation of the Lancaster Vision Zero policy, which had been planned and discussed over several years. There was a series of public meetings that took place over the course of developing those plans and a series of goals that were set. Goals around creating better opportunities for non-motorized travel, increasing transportation options, especially for vulnerable populations that don't have access to cars, around increasing safety, around decreasing the amount of fatalities and severe injuries, These were all of the goals in the public discourse that went into these two plans. And from them, the eastbound connector was identified on the active transportation plan as the eastbound route through the city of Lancaster. Walnut Street was identified as the westbound. And this is really an opportunity to make a pair with Walnut Street. So you can go westbound on Walnut and eastbound on Lemon. I do want to note that when this plan was first identified, Chestnut Street was the route that was originally identified to be the eastbound route. However, when we looked more deeply into the traffic volumes on Chestnut and the typical street section on Chestnut, we determined that that was not going to be a feasible location to do a separated bicycle facility. In order to get a separated bicycle facility there, you would need to remove an entire lane of parking for the extent of Chestnut Street, which we recognize is not feasible in a parking constrained area. So we did some additional analysis to look at other routes that could achieve that eastbound separated facility. We recognize that there are other places in the city where you might be able to ride with traffic and feel fairly comfortable. But throughout the active transportation plan process, we were trying to identify these separated facilities that can work for the largest number of riders. And those are folks that do not feel comfortable being with traffic. They need a separated facility to make them feel like they're able to be out riding. In addition to the connectivity just directly in the downtown of Lancaster, there's also an opportunity to connect to the larger regional network through the future Greater Lancaster Heritage Pathway. And you can see here how that connection is going to allow people to travel by bike to larger areas within the region. As I mentioned, throughout the development of the active transportation plan, we wanted to look at opportunities for creating roadway improvements that would address safety concerns for all users on the high injury network and create low-stress, separated facilities that can attract more users. When we do surveys that look at how people view biking, this is both surveys within the city of Lancaster, within the county, and nationwide, typically riders fall into four main categories. There's the no way, no how, and these are folks that are not interested in riding really no matter what kind of facilities that there are out in the street. But there's a very large percentage, about 50 to 60% of riders that are interested but concerned. They'd like to be out riding their bikes more, but they're concerned about doing it in mixed traffic. Or if they're going to be doing it in mixed traffic, it needs to be incredibly low volumes and low speeds. And what that usually entails is we want to create low stress environments. Low stress bicycle environments typically are ones that are separated from vehicular traffic and or are very low speeds or low volumes. And you can see here the continuum of different types of bicycle facilities with something, the lowest stress is going to be something that's a shared use path, a trail, something that's not in the road at all. The one that we're talking about here tonight is a separated bike lane. It is in the road, but it's physically separated from traffic by parked cars and vertical treatments. And that's going to create that safest, most comfortable facility for the greatest number of riders, which allows us to increase and have more people biking on Lancaster streets. The project vision and goals that we started out with is being able to have a corridor where people can travel comfortably and safely by bicycle between communities and destinations. We had a series of goals that we're trying to achieve around creating a low-speed environment, so trying to get to that about 20 miles per hour. Also increase the number of people biking on Lemon Street and through downtown Lancaster, serving those interested but concerned riders, so getting to that largest number of riders. And of course, reducing crashes for all modes along the high injury network. Lemon Street was identified as a corridor on the high injury network, so we know that this is a location where there are crash concerns. And the types of improvements that we're talking about Lemon Street, they don't just make things safer for cyclists. They slow speeds down, they make crossings safer for pedestrians, and they help reduce those severe injuries and fatalities for all users of the roadway. To give you an overview of the design that we're looking at for the corridor, for most of the corridor, we are talking about a parking separated bike lane. Traditionally, when we think about parking, we always think about doing it right up next to the curb, and then you might have a bicycle lane next to it and then travel lanes. In a parking separated bike lane, you switch the directions of the parking and the bike lane. So the bike lane is right up next to the curb. This is what you see on Walnut Street today. There's then a buffer area between the bike lane and the parked cars. This provides room for a driver to open their door and not hit the cyclist riding through. And then you have the lanes of travel next to it. And once again, this provides that physical separation between the cars traveling on the street and the bicyclists in the bike lane. Parking separated bike lanes are starting to be adopted more and more throughout the US. They've evolved as we recognize the need for safe separated facilities while also recognizing that we need places to park our cars. This means that there is a little bit of a trade-off for everyone on these. There are spots where you might lose a parking space at the intersections to keep things clear. However, it does keep the majority of the parking as opposed to some other bicycle facilities that might require the removal of parking. Some of the things that parking separated bike lanes do that is really helpful in terms of safety is they reduce the number of mid-block crashes on streets, especially with higher speeds and volumes. Because the bicyclists are fully protected in the mid-block, they're not getting hit by cars that are passing them. This is really critical in terms of Vision Zero because mid-block is where you have the highest number of fatalities and high injuries. This is because cars are traveling the fastest mid-block. So if you get hit by if you're on your bike and you get hit by a car mid-block, it's going to be very problematic. If anything, as cars slow down, that's where we see those severe injuries and fatalities lessening. So it's one of the great things that parking separated bike lanes does. It creates that comfortable facilities for all ages and abilities while also increasing cyclist volumes as folks feel more comfortable using the facility. It does maintain parking in some capacity. And when appropriate design treatments are used, it can also reduce crash severity and make things safer at intersections. And that intersection design is something that we're really going to be focusing on in the meeting tonight to tell you about how we've changed the design for the intersections. So here you can see a typical street section of Lemon Street today on the left, and then the proposed street section on the right. In the existing street section, there are two 8.5-foot parking lines on either side of the street, and then relatively wide 13-foot travel lanes, one lane in each direction. In the proposed condition, we keep an 8-foot parking lane on the north side of the street. There are then two 10-foot vehicular travel lanes, a 7.5 to 8-foot parking lane on the south side, a 2 to 3-foot buffer, and then the 5-foot bike lane next to the curb. I do want to note that the parking lane widths, this is something that has evolved over the course of the project. When we first came out to the first public meeting, we had narrower parking lanes and wider buffer for the bikes, but we heard from folks that 7 feet is too narrow for these parking lanes. That's why we made sure that on the north side, we're keeping that 8-foot consistent. The only time that we narrow it down to that 7.5 on the south side is where areas of Lemon Street are a bit more narrow, and that's why you see that range between the 2 and the 3 foot and the 7.5 to 8. So the smallest buffer that we have is 2 feet, smallest bike lane is 7.5. Next you can see some images of what this would look like. So today, this is the view mid-block, and in the future you can see how the lanes have been shifted over. We have the parking lane, and then the bike lane separated out on the right. This is just an overview of some of the different tools that we have in our design toolkit for the project. As I mentioned, I'm talking mostly about the typical section of Lemon Street. There are some areas in the project where we would be in a shared bike lane condition. This is where Lemon Street goes down to one lane, so we won't have a dedicated bike lane there. We do have an area where we would be in a buffered bike lane. This is where we have a series of driveways on the 200 block, so we can't have a separated facility there. And throughout the corridor, some other things that we are installing: daylighting at intersections. This is where you ensure that you don't have parked cars right up to the crosswalk there to keep sight lines very clear. We're looking at flexible delineator posts that you can put in to actually outline those daylighting areas. We recognize that just painting a daylighting area doesn't mean that people don't park there. The flex posts will keep people from parking there. We're looking at slow turn wedges, which you can see here. This is something else we'll be talking about more as the presentation continues. What that does is it really slows traffic turning. So if you're traveling eastbound on Lemon, a slow turn wedge is going to keep cars that are turning right in their lane and going as slow as possible around that turn. We've heard on Walnut Street the concerns around cars moving quickly, making a turn, not seeing bikes. This helps to slow things down, especially combined with the delineator post that keeps the daylighting area clear. We're looking at bike boxes to help move bicyclists from the bike lane into another bicycle facility. We're looking at signage that alerts folks to a bike lane beginning or ending, kind of noting that bicycles may use full lane in other areas of the corridor, that there's no parking, it's a bike lane. Different treatments that are going to alert folks to what's happening along the corridor and let them know how they should be using the space. At this point, I want to go through some of the questions that we received at the last public meeting, our responses to those questions, and how the design of the corridor has changed as a result of those questions. You can see these are some of the general questions that were asked, and I'll be going through these one by one. So one of the questions that we received last time is, what defines success? You're talking about do this project. What does that mean? How would you say that the project was successful? From our perspective, the main ways that this would be seen as successful is that we would be reducing motor vehicle speeds and getting them closer to that 20 miles per hour. That 20 mile per hour is a key number when you're talking about Vision Zero, because if you're going 20 miles per hour and someone does happen to get hit, you're much more likely to have a positive outcome. You're less likely to have a fatality or a severe injury. So we're trying to keep those speeds slow. It's been shown many times that by narrowing the lanes, traffic moves slower, and you're going to reduce the number of severe fatalities that are happening along the corridor today. Another indicator of success would be an increase in the number of people biking. We have bike counts that were done just this past year. We can share that data with you tonight, and being able to see those numbers increase over the years as more and more folks feel comfortable using the facility, another thing that would point us to success. Reducing the number of crashes and reducing crash severity. As I mentioned, this is directly tied to slowing down speeds on Lemon Street, which narrowing things down is all going to contribute to that success. And then finally, eliminating Lemon Street from the Vision Zero high injury network. This is not a line on the map that we want to be there. We want to eradicate that line and make this a safe place for all to use. Another question that we received is, why is it important to increase cycling in Lancaster? Why is this something that the city is taking on? And really this goes back to providing transportation options in many ways. Providing equitable infrastructure that gives people the option to move safely within the region by modes other than vehicles. We recognize that not everyone has access to a car, and we're trying to provide safe, comfortable options for people outside of just driving. That doesn't mean that driving isn't an option as well, but providing those other options. Also supporting active and sustainable transportation mobility. If you look at Lancaster streets today and the amount of density you have, the density isn't going away, and the streets can't get any bigger. It's built out. So the only way to reduce congestion is to provide other options that take up less space than cars. Bicycles is one way to get there. Bicycle counts. We had some questions about the bicycle counts that the city was in the process of wrapping up and what those bicycle counts revealed. Those counts showed that people are typically traveling eastbound by bike on Lemon Street. So when the counts showed, most of the traveling was happening in the eastbound direction. And for the most part, we were seeing that riders were using it as a through corridor rather than making turns, which really means that it's more conducive to a parking separated bike lane, where it is, when you're in the parking separated bike lane, when you get to an intersection, the bicycle has to make sure to be looking where they're going and crossing with traffic to make a turn off of the corridor. It's much easier to just stay on the route and go more end to end on it. So the amount of turning movements that we were seeing showed us that most people are using it the way we would intend it to be used, and that it would be conducive to a parking separated bike lane. And here you can see a diagram of the kind of counts that we were getting. We took counts at two locations, Lemon and Water Street, and Lemon and Christian Street at 2 times a day, both the morning, kind of the morning peak, and the afternoon peak. Once again, you can see by the arrows, we're seeing 15 eastbound, 8 eastbound through, so those are traveling through, with a few folks here and there making turns onto Water or onto Christian, right turns from the facility, which once again, those would be turns that would be actually very easy to make from the parking separated bike lane. You'd already be on the right-hand side of the street. In the PM peak, we're once again seeing eastbound through movements and a few left turns at Water Street and at Christian Street. We also received a question about why James Street wasn't considered as an alternative instead of Lemon Street, since it is relatively low traffic volumes. We did look at James Street. It is a narrower roadway, so that there is not a way to put a separated facility in there. We talked earlier about the fact that if you look at an active transportation plan for the city, you're going to have a lot of different types of corridors. You're going to have some spots where people will be traveling with vehicular traffic. We want to put those as much as possible in those low volume streets. But the vision for the active transportation plan was to have these dedicated facilities in the eastbound and the westbound route, and that James Street is not feasible to do that with the amount of width that there is in the road. You can't get that separated facility on there. It's also less connected to other bicycle facilities. It makes a lot of out-of-direction travel required. As you can see on the map on the next page, this is the eastbound connector alignment here in red, and this is the future Greater Lancaster Heritage Trail in purple that we are trying to get to on either side. So for the James Street alternative, you'd be coming up and around and back down. And once again, that would not be a dedicated facility. That would be a shared facility where the bikes would be in moving traffic. We received a question, why is the city proposing a parking separated bike lane instead of a traditional buffered bike lane? Mainly here, we want to talk about speed, the appropriate speeds and volumes that are appropriate for these different types of facilities. We want to talk about reducing crashes on the Vision Zero network, creating as separate a facility as possible to get those crashes down, and also trying to carry out recommendations from the Active Transportation Plan and the Vision Zero Action Plan, both of which point to the need for a separated facility rather than a buffered one. And to go into a little more detail on that, if we look at the volumes on Lemon Street, the Federal Highway Administration guidance has this chart that shows how, as your speeds go up and your volumes go up, your bicycle facility needs to get more and more separated for it to be safe. The dots there coincide on this chart here, the current volumes on Lemon Street, and if we look over time as volumes increase, and we can see that those dots are getting more and more into the, you need to be in a separated bike lane to make this a safe facility. Once again, this is federal guidance. This is something as we're choosing bike lanes throughout the country, this is what we go to again and again to determine what is the appropriate facility type. And from a volume standpoint, very much it's pointing towards a separated facility rather than a buffered one. And you can see here, one of the reasons is if we were to do the buffered bike lane option, because we have a limited amount of buffer available to us, especially in very narrow parts of the corridor, we're getting only less than 0 to 2 feet here between the bike lane and the parked car lane, which easily can result in the condition that you see in the photo of bicyclists getting doored. So as a driver opens their door, they open it into the bike lane, and this can be very dangerous for cyclists moving through the corridor. So with that, I'm going to transition into, as a result of the questions and the comments that we received at the last public meeting, some of the conceptual changes that we have made to the design. But before we get into Lemon Street, one thing that we heard loud and clear at our last meetings was we need changes to Walnut Street. There are safety issues there that need to be addressed. And before we go too far down the road of Lemon Street, we want to make sure that things are being addressed on Walnut. So we'd like to share with you today the design changes that are being proposed for Walnut Street, which would be able to be installed likely this spring. And we want to talk through how those are going to change the way the corridor is used. And there's similar treatments to what we're looking to do on Lemon Street as well. And just to summarize, we're looking at doing flex posts at intersections to make sure that we're actually marking it out so cars can't park in those daylighting areas. We're adding what's called an inlet bend out to increase visibility at intersections. I can talk about that more. Adding daylighting at some cross streets to improve visibility at the intersection. Extending daylighting at some areas where visibility is poor today and having some extra spot where you don't have parked cars there to make that work better. Adding in those slow turn wedges at some intersections that I mentioned earlier to keep cars moving as slowly as possible as they are crossing in front of the bike lane. Adding bike boxes at some intersections to help bicyclists move on to other connected facilities. And adding in signage, no parking, bike lane, and other types of signs to alert both cyclists, drivers, and pedestrians to how the corridor is intended to be used. Here you can see a summary of all the intersections where we're recommending these changes. In green, we're looking at new bike boxes at College Avenue and Mulberry Avenue. We're looking at adding the inlet bend outs at Nevin, Mary, Charlotte, Concord, Arch, Water, Franklin, and Reservoir. And then we're also looking at slow turn wedges at Elm, Pine, Lancaster, Prince, Queen, Anne, and Marshall. And just to give you a sense of how some of these improvements might look on Walnut Street, the photo on the left is the existing parking separated bike lane on Walnut today. And here's how we can add in all these treatments to make that intersection safer. We add the inlet bend out, which basically means where we know that we have an inlet right here that bicyclists do not feel comfortable riding through that. It's very sunken. It can be very jarring on the bike. We have a bend out here to alert them that they should be shifting somewhat at the intersection. We have the slow turn wedge. This is located right in front of the crosswalk. So as a car is making a left turn here, there is a small raised structure here that helps slow them down, keep them in their lane around the slow turn wedge. They have a full view of the bike because they're coming at them at a right angle instead of cutting the turn here in front of the crosswalk. We have daylighting and flex posts at the intersection. Once again, this ensures there's not a car parked here. So the cars that are moving through here can see the bikes. They have visibility on them. The bikes can see the moving cars. It makes everything much safer at the intersection. And also adding bike lane signage in to alert drivers that this is a bike lane. We've heard from many of you, both bicyclists and non, about how these intersections on Walnut aren't working today. And we are confident that these kinds of improvements, these are best practices nationwide that are being used. This is going to make these crossings much safer. And as I mentioned, there's multiple locations along the corridor. Wherever we have turning cars coming in front of the bike lane, that's where we're looking for these types of treatments. And we're also looking to do those on Lemon Street. And to summarize those, and this is once again what has changed since our last design, we're looking to remove those mid-block flex posts. We want to focus the flex posts at the intersections where you're going to get the most bang for your buck. That's where we're making sure that cars are not parked in the daylighting area. Mid-block, in a lot of observations of the corridor, we're finding cars are not parked right up to the curb. So we feel confident that folks are used to how this facility is supposed to be used. We don't need to put those flex posts mid-block. So we're going to focus those at the intersections. We're adding bike lane bend outs at some intersections to increase the visibility of bikes. I'll talk about those in a little more detail and show you some images. We're adding those slow turn wedges at some intersections, similar to what we're doing on Walnut Street. We made some changes to the Walnut and the Lemon Street intersection, recognizing there's a lot of concerns around sight distances, especially for cars moving northbound on Water that are creeping out into the intersection. How can we increase visibility there? And then adding signage similar to Walnut Street. So to give an overview of where we're looking at these types of improvements, for the inlet bend outs, we're looking at Nevin and Mary Street. The slow turn wedges, we're looking at Pine, Lancaster Avenue, Water Street, and Duke Street. So this is a zoom in of a slow turn wedge. This is where you can see this is a two-way bike lane that's going through an intersection. And what this does is these are the raised pieces of the slow turn wedge here. So a car that is making a right turn here can't just cut across the bike lane right here. They have to be out into the intersection going, this forces them to go as slow as possible and provide the greatest amount of visibility to, between the bicyclist and the car moving through the intersection. Here you can see the design of this at some of the key intersections, Lemon and Pine Street. So here's the slow turn wedge out here, Pine's heading south. So the bicyclist would be here right next to the curb, and this would ensure that the car is all the way out here when it goes to make its turn. And we show these also at Lemon and Lancaster and Lemon at Duke Street. And you're welcome to take a look at these in more detail at the roll plots after the presentation if you want to take a closer look. Signage will be another important thing that will be added in here. Putting in signs to alert people to the start and end of a bike lane, having signs that alert turning vehicles to yield to bicyclists, no turn on red, bicyclists may use full lane. We'll also be posting signage of no parking to once again show areas, sign the areas where parking is not allowed. We recognize that without this signage, it can be very confusing to folks how the corridor is supposed to be used, and this will help to further delineate that. Daylighting is another thing, and as I mentioned, especially using the flex post to delineate it. Daylighting is typically saying that you cannot have parking right up to the crosswalk. And this is really critical because if there's a car parked here, both the car has no idea that bikes are here and the bikes don't know the cars are there, especially when they're coming in to do a turn in front of the bicycles. So keeping that daylighting area in front of the crosswalk clear is very critical. And also identifying areas where that space might need to get a little bit longer based on sight distances. And that's one of the things we looked at the intersection with Water Street. We know that it's not enough to just paint the daylighting areas. To really be effective, we need to add in the flex post at the corners to ensure that cars can't park there and make that intersection as clear for all users as possible. So that's something that will be added in to the Lemon Street project as well as Walnut. We also want to talk about bend outs. We recognize that in the tight grid that Lancaster has with buildings built up straight up to the edge here, when you have cars moving northbound, they tend to creep out and out and out to be able to see around and know when it's clear for them to make a turn or move through the intersection. With bicyclists right up here next to the curb, that sight distance becomes very tight, and it's problematic for both the bikes and the cars. So what we're looking at a couple intersections, such as Nevin and Mary Street, is we actually bend the bikes out so that they are further into the intersection, near the center lane of the road, and this makes them much more visible to the cars waiting down here that are waiting to move through the intersection. So you can see, once again, they bend out, and then after the intersection, they move back in next to the curb. We're looking at that at Nevin and Mary Street, and also some of the locations that I mentioned on Walnut Street. This is another area that I invite you to look at the roll plots if you have more questions about those or how those can work. Another intersection that came up a lot in conversations with the community is Water Street and Lemon Street. And we took a closer look at the crash data for this one and recognized that, once again, sight distances are a major issue here today, just based on the existing condition where we have this building, especially in the southeast corner. We have a building right up, a tall building right next to the corner. And as cars are coming out here trying to figure out if they're able to move through the intersection, it's very tight. So what we did was we extended the parking daylighting in the southeast corner to go further, and that'll help address that sightline issue and make that better for all users. We've also added in a slow turn wedge at this intersection, and we also just want to talk through the fact that right now the plan that we show here is what would be constructed kind of as an interim solution when this project goes through, probably at the end of 2022. However, we're also working on an intersecting project here, the Water Street Bike-Ped Boulevard, which will have some more permanent solutions to the intersection and some changes to the curbs and the sidewalks. And when that ultimate project is done, on the north side of the street, you'll have a wider sidewalk that'll serve as a shared use path with a direct connection to the linear park that's at the northwest corner of the intersection. In the interim solution, we show a painted bike lane a crosswalk, a painted bike crosswalk, and then a bike lane to provide that access. But the long-term solution will be that shared use path on the north side of the street, but also mimicking the bend in here and the extended daylighting. So there will be further design work that is done on that intersection, but these are improvements that we think we can get in the ground much sooner as part of the Eastbound Connector project. So that concludes all of the design changes that have been made after the last meeting. In terms of next steps for the project, we'll be looking to incorporate the public input from the meeting tonight, similar to how we have done at other public meetings on the project. And then we will be moving into the final design phase, so getting these plans that you see here tonight, the final construction documents, with the anticipated construction in 2022 of the project.